Hello, everyone, and welcome to, again, my living room. I don't think most of you know this, but I did suffer a rather difficult injury on Friday. So I'm actually not allowed to walk. Actually not allowed to walk a whole lot. I'm not allowed to put any pressure on my foot. So I am currently attempting not to do that, which means that unfortunately for you, rather than being in my office as I prefer to be, I am in fact sitting in my living room. Hopefully I got the lighting a little bit better now, and I've got a new camera, and hopefully the quality of the videos will in fact improve a little bit as we go. So today I wanted to give you a brief lecture on a slew of people because we don't have much from them, but what we do have is important. And so as we move out of the medieval period and into the early Renaissance and late Renaissance and Enlightenment, it's very important that we capture at least a few of these so that we can understand what the heck was happening with all these little pieces of literature, really, or philosophy, religious writings and letters and essays. I mean, these are not considered rhetoricians or pieces of rhetoric or works on rhetoric even. But what they do end up doing is actually mentioning it, and they do end up sort of becoming our guideline for rhetoric during this time. So let's dive into that. I'm going to talk to you about Saint Augustine, and he, of course, was important because some people say he's the only reason why rhetoric survived during the medieval period, because he taught us how to use rhetoric in the church. Even though rhetoric was demonized, it was considered pagan, it aroused the passions. So it got you like overly worked up, and it could be used to persuade people to become interested in something evil. It needed to be used against the devil, against evil. It needed to be used to defend Christianity, and therefore it also needed to be used to be proactive, not just in converting others, but in having good sort of church experiences. So like the gospel needed to be preached once those became, knowledge base for the clergy. But what was coming out of Rome needed to be shared in such a way that people understood. And really, at that time, what else was a rhetorician supposed to do? If a rhetorician truly is a person who explains the government to the people, and the government is in fact the church, well then, seems to me that that's what rhetoricians should be doing. And where they did that was in the churches. So St. Augustine, says, I'm not going to talk about rhetoric, and then he talks about rhetoric. And you get to the end of a very long treatise, which you have a very, very short portion of. But that very, very long treatise, he says, look, if you don't understand this, you're just stupid. Or you need to go back and reread it, or, if you didn't find it interesting, it's because that's your fault. So there's a lot of things that you need to do when you read Augustine, and you have to set aside. And one of those is his hubris, but he was an extremely successful sophist. He had a lot of money and access to things that other people didn't have. So, that's something that you kind of have to keep in mind. But Augustine didn't single-handedly save rhetoric. I mean, rhetoric was never going to completely go away. We had the sophists still practicing. We still needed lawyers. We still needed teachers. We still needed preachers. And so if preachers could use rhetoric, obviously that was going to continue. The texts, the actual physical writings of the students of the great Greeks and Romans were actually preserved by Islamic monks, I believe is the term that is appropriate. They saved these things even though they had no interest in them in the sense of, using them to govern or for their religious purposes so much as they were antiquities. And the Catholic Church was literally burning these down. I don't know how many of you are Catholic. I'm Catholic, so I say this with some level of actual experience and knowledge. of the church. And if you are Catholic, you'll understand what I'm saying. If you're not Catholic, I think you'll still get it, which is that sometimes the Catholic Church does things that people don't like. And it's all for the purpose of trying to maintain control. Now, these days, that's not really a thing unless you're at the Vatican. We don't really concern ourselves with it. I suppose hardcore Catholics might. I'm not really sure. I'm like the worst Catholic ever. So I don't really know about people in America who go to church. But, you know, the Pope tells us what to do. But Catholics in America have always kind of said, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. You know, no matter what he does, or, yeah, no. One of the biggest things to come out of this is the confession, right? The idea that we go and talk to a priest about all of our sins, and he is the one who forgives us. And yeah, I say he because they're still all male, which is ridiculous. They're still taking vows of poverty. Well, no, they don't take a vow of poverty. They take a vow of chastity, which, you know, clearly that's been violated on multiple occasions. Some of the really, really good priests who are, you know, devout to their vows will tell you that confession is absolutely necessary. To quote Alanis Morissette, why am I going and telling an envious man about what I've done when I can just confess it? And yeah, that's actually from a song she wrote, which I'm not sure any of you have ever heard. But that's the truth, is that a lot of Catholics today, we can disagree with the Pope, and it's not really going to do a whole hell of a lot. But during the medieval period, you know, you could get your head chopped off. I mean, there were really bad things happening to people who disagreed with the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church as it is today, doesn't look anything like it did back then, except in one way, and that is that we could, you know, I say we as if it's me, but I was trained as a Jesuit in college, my undergraduate, and so the Jesuits are sort of the academic arm of the Catholic Church, and the Jesuits are a little more liberal than the Catholic Church, generally speaking, but what the Catholic Church has done is it tries to rewrite history. I don't think that's shocking to anybody, whether you're Catholic or not, whether you're Christian or not, whether you're religious or not, or have any faith at all, and whatever that is, it doesn't matter. You probably understand that the Catholic Church had a great deal of power to control the narrative of where we come from. And that is why it used to be called Before Christ and Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. And now we've acknowledged that, oh, there might be other people on the planet who don't think of the world that way. Imagine that. Shocker of shocks, right? And that's why we've changed it to before the Common Era, BCE, and the Common Era, CE, right? Because we have to acknowledge that there were choices that were made. And I'm not talking about like what books are in the Bible. That is certainly one of them. But you know, you might not care about that at all whatsoever, but other things that have come out of the Catholic Church rule, if you will, that you don't even realize, like the calendar. That's a completely Christian thing. Why? I don't know. But if you follow the history of it, that's where it comes from. Either Gregorian monks, the Caesarean calendar, all of it out of Rome. Okay, so the calendar and the way that we count years all centers around the birth of Christ. And whether that's completely accurate or not, different question. But that's where it comes from. And let's see, what are some other things that the Catholic Church did that you would recognize today? Oh yeah, how about this? How about the fact that the generally accepted term for humans up until about the 1990s was him and he. It didn't include women, apparently. We weren't a thing. I mean, we didn't even vote until 1921. So think about that. It's been almost 100 years. We're getting there. So really, there's a very, very strong influence of the Holy Roman Catholic Church during the medieval period, which again could be anywhere from 600 to 1600 years, depending on which historian you talk to, long, which is a chunk of time, no matter how you look at it, especially when you consider the human history on this planet and what's been recorded. All right, so that's why it's important to understand that during the medieval period, following the fall of the Roman Empire, that this was still the influence, that the preaching was really a big part of religion, of rhetoric. And what ends up happening is along the way came some thought called the humanist thought, which of course interrupted the Catholic Church, interrupted the religious idea, and said, hey, you know what, maybe we humans have something to say too. Maybe we don't want to be in this feudal system anymore. Maybe we want to break out, break free, get a little education for ourselves. Maybe we want the ability to gain land of our own and not continue to work for the same person that my family's been working for 10 generations, literally. Those are the kinds of things that started to invade. But before they did, there's two other people during the medieval period I want to talk about briefly. And really, it's the late medieval, moving into an early Renaissance period, so it's a good transition. And those two people happen to be female. And I'm going to be talking about them not so much as rhetoricians, as much as how they contributed to our understanding of the time period and what rhetoric was doing. So let's start there with the first one. That's Christine de Pizan. What the heck did she do? She wrote a great book about how to be polite, right? She wrote us an etiquette book. That's what a lot of people think. But read it again. And what you really get is Christine de Pizan explaining how women in the court, ladies of the high court, can have influence. Okay? So that's really what that's about. It's about understanding what position you're in the class system and what you can do with that for you. Really, the betterment of people is really what Christine de Pizan was writing for. Now, who is she and why is she important? By the way, interesting point of fact, if you Google Dudash and Christine de Pizan, apparently there's some like French literist at the University of Notre Dame, I think, whose name is Melissa Dudash maybe, or something like that, who studies Christine de Pizan. It's bizarre. I had a really, really weird experience once when I was researching Christine de Pizan. The world is very small. And so Christine de Pizan also, prior to writing The City of Ladies and The Treasure of the City of Ladies, was really a writer for money. So she would write the poems that the knights would read as favors to the ladies, and she would sell them. And the reason she had to do that was because her father and her husband both had died. She had children and her mother to raise and to take care of and to pay for. And how was she going to do that? She just happened to be lucky enough that her father worked in the court for one of the kings, and she was able to be educated, mostly by her just being around people who were educated. And remember that Quintilian and Cicero both said, be around people who are educated and you can get educated too. That's a good way to do it. Just rub elbows with the right people. If you ever saw Good Will Hunting, you know that this is also true. So Christine de Pizan really utilized as much as she could to help the right people in power to practice rhetoric most effectively. I've had students say to me, well, really, isn't she the first organizational rhetorician? She talks about an organization, a hierarchy, the power structure, and how people can move through it and, negotiate it through language. And I mean, I guess, I don't think that was her intent, but it certainly is an interesting hint at what would come later. All right, the second person I want to talk about is a name I'm forgotten right at the moment, Margaret Fell. Thank you. It just came to my head. Margaret Fell. And it actually should be Margaret Fell Fox is the way that her life went. Interesting story. Margaret Fell was the only heir to her father's land. And back then, women couldn't own land. So she had to marry so that her husband would be able to keep the land. Otherwise, the land hand would go to a male cousin or a distant relative, and they didn't want that to happen. So she married a judge, a circuit judge. So literally he was gone most of the time, making the circuit to these different townships and communities in order to be a judge for them when they needed it. That's where the term circuit court comes from. That idea that the judge would go and do a circuit of judgments and then take a break and then go back and do it again. So he was gone for long periods of time. And and Margaret, of course, ran this house. I mean, and when I say house, it's called Swarthmore Hall. Why is it called a hall? Well, because it's freaking huge. So it was a large place, and it had a space, I believe, on the first floor, right in the opening. It had a very large space that was able to be utilized for gatherings. And so one day, Margaret Fell happened to hear a preacher named Fox, and she heard him and she thought he was fantastic, and so she sponsored him. The problem with Fox is that he wasn't a preacher for any particular religion. He was preaching almost a Protestant sort of religion, which turned out, when I say Protestant, I mean it went against the Catholic Church in some ways. And really it's what became Quakerism. And it became Quakerism because of Margaret Fell and this guy Fox. That's really where it started. And Margaret started what is known as the Circle of Friends. Now, if you know anything about Quakerism, it's a very modest religion. It is not Mennonite. It is not Mormon. It is completely different from those. I've had people compare them. No. Quakerism is about peace. It's not necessarily Amish either, just so we're all clear on that. It is about, she actually really felt that the Circle of Friends should be leaders who are women in the church. So one of the arguments she needed to make was that women should be allowed to speak in the church. Now, she was not talking about going out and speaking publicly, because that was considered dirty and it would actually somehow hurt you as a woman, your purity, your status as a woman of cleanliness if you went out and spoke in public. So women did not speak in public. They certainly did not talk about dirty politics. And so, but she was talking strictly about in the church, women should have a role. They should be allowed to speak. So her piece called Women Speaking Justified, imagine that. It's really women speaking justified inside the church, or in the church, literally. That's what she was arguing for. And so knowing her audience, what she did was taking Fox's teaching, she really utilized the Bible as evidence for women being allowed to speak in the church. So again, if you're not religious or faithful, or if you weren't practicing, you didn't care about this, and you know, some people still don't, but she was and that's fine, but she was the first one to really say women should be allowed to speak in the church. This is what led to the potential for female preachers, by the way, in other religions. I say Protestant again, because not in the Catholic Church, we don't do that. So, you know, we really have this juxtaposition of her wanting women to have a role because God sent Mary Magdalene. God sent 3 women to announce Jesus's resurrection. These are all stories from the Bible, by the way. Eve, while she was tempted by the serpent, she was the first to speak. God utilizes women a lot, okay? And he made Eve to be a counterpart to Adam, not to be subservient. And Fox agreed with this. Now, Quakerism means that you cannot do things like swear on the Bible, okay? So both Fox and Fell were arrested for having these clandestine meetings, for trying to sort of rebel against the church. There were all sorts of reasons. Heresy, I believe, was one of them. All these reasons And Fox served a decent amount of time in jail. Margaret less so. But Margaret Fell served some time because she refused to swear on the Bible. And, you know, in the court of law, that's what they did. We choose different things now. But she swore on, or she would not swear on the Bible, and therefore she was jailed for a short period of time. Fox wrote a lot from his jail cell when he was in jail. Now, when he got out and she got out and they were free, apparently the judge had died at some point in here. Nobody knows. I have a soap opera version of this in my head. I'm sure you can figure that out. But at some point the judge died, and Fox and Margaret Fell got married. So that's why I say she became Margaret Fell Fox. Now, this is really at the end of the Renaissance period, medieval period, and really at the beginning of the Renaissances. But it's where humanism was coming in to say, hey, we humans have something to say that's important, whether it is to go against the Bible, to go against the church, to supplement the church, to explain the Bible, to do what Augustine said, you know, to preach, to teach, and to convert, you know, whatever it was, that we had the right to do that, because humans are important too. Human thought has to be important. And one of the arguments that they made really was that it was a gift given by God. And we're going to get into that a little bit, but I'll prefer to shy away from that as much as possible, because you might be asking yourself, why don't we talk about Eastern religions or practices or governments? And the answer is very simple. It goes back to that Roman rule that I told you about. The more centralized a government, the less need there is for rhetoric. And the more decentralized a government, the greater the need for rhetoric. Well, there's only been two republics in the history of the world, and that's Rome and us. That's it. Rome and us. I mean, Greece was really an experiment in direct democracy that did not, I mean, it worked for a time, right? But it didn't work as well as Rome did. Rome, while it was a shorter or a longer period of time, it also was more successful in its organization and its structure. And of course, we are not yet at an age, I mean, we're getting close to, I think we are now the longest republic. You have to remember, I was born in 1974, 2 years before our country turned 200. So we're still a young democracy, but we're the oldest democracy, the oldest republic on the planet, and the longest running one. So what happens when that starts to deteriorate is there's less need for rhetoric. Well, in the Eastern countries, first of all, we didn't want to know about them because the Catholic Church said, those heathens, we don't want to know about them. Those Muslims, those Buddhists, nope, don't care how long they've been on the planet, they're wrong, right? The Catholic Church really said that. And they're wrong, of course, but they said that. And so in doing so, we didn't need to talk about other religions. And since their governments were centralized, we didn't need to talk about democracy and participation from citizens. So that's two main reasons why we don't end up studying anything really interesting except, you know, Western philosophy of old dead white guys for a while. But it's important. It's important for us to understand the context of this, right? That there's a reason why we're looking at these particular writers. Now, I did have you read some diverse works, and we'll get into more diverse works as we get closer to the postmodern period, okay? But for right now, we're trapped in this period, this time period of religion. Now, the Renaissances come up, and I have to say Renaissances because the plural is not Renaissance, sadly. But these Renaissances coming up, right? We have the European Renaissance, we got the Russian Renaissance, we got all these different Renaissances that come up. And during that time, the humanists are rising, and there's a sparked interest in something very important, and that is art. So during the Renaissances, unlike the medieval period where it was sort of rhetoric versus the church, in the Renaissances, we have a whole new shift. We've got, first of all, triangle. Okay, so we have three things that are sort of in opposition to each other. The first being rhetoric, of course, because we always start there. The other being science or reason. Okay, those words are used sort of interchangeably sometimes, and there is a difference, and there's a reason why they don't make that distinction during the Renaissance writers, but it's probably not something you need to know unless you go get your PhD in rhetoric, which if you do, let me know. and we'll talk about the difference between them, but reason and science are sort of together. And then you have the aesthetic, the art, okay, the beauty of things. And so all of a sudden, the poets, the rhetoricians, and the scientists are fighting with each other about what the purpose of rhetoric really is. What is the purpose of persuasion? Is it for beauty? Is it to argue science or to discover truth? Or is it for only like government action? Don't know. Actually, I do. But they have this debate. And you know what? They all have pretty good arguments. And I think the answer that we're going to come to is all three. And we'll see how that happens. But if you're curious and you want a slight hint, think about it this way. Can poetry or art make an argument? And can an argument be eloquent and poetic? That's a pretty easy answer, I think, to both of those. So if you've ever watched a movie and thought, well, that's a really interesting argument they're making, then boom, you've got it. Art is making an argument, okay, which makes it inherently rhetoric. All right. So as we move into the Renaissance, we're also going to encounter one other guy who's sort of on the border between the medieval period and the Renaissance, who's going to push us over that edge into the Renaissance, and that's Peter Ramus. It is very important that you read his work. He rips into Quintilian and Aristotle in ways that are just brutal. I mean, at one point he says, let me use a syllogism to prove why Aristotle has a bad syllogism. Of course, if you ask me, Ramus's syllogism is horrifying because it's not based on premises that we actually agree on. So there is some problem there. But he rips Quintilian apart because Quintilian had said, you know, that a good orator or a good rhetorician is a good person who speaks well. And Ramus just loses it. He's like, you don't have to be a good person to practice rhetoric. Anybody can practice rhetoric. That's a given. Why are we now adding ethics and saying, oh, well, if you're a good person who's speaking well, now you are in fact a rhetorician? We're exploding the definition of rhetorician. And he uses the example of art, that if I paint pictures and I'm an artist, should I then be defined by how well I sculpt? Gotta hope not, because I'm horrible at it, just so we're all clear on that. But like, you know, and obviously that's the case, but is that really a good comparison for rhetoric versus science, and for what rhetoric is supposed to do? I don't know. I don't think so. You can think about that. What Ramus does then is he makes the argument, sorry, cuckoo clock in the background. He makes the argument that rhetoric should be separated into two things, because God gave us two gifts. He gave us the power to speak and he gave us the ability to reason. Therefore, rhetoric cannot include both. So it's either the art of eloquence and speaking, or it's reasoning and discovery. And so what he does is he breaks up the five canons and he says, listen, rhetoric can be this aesthetic beauty, and it can include style and delivery. But that's it. Instead of being, that's the art. Instead of being science and reason, which is invention, arrangement, and memory. So he really divides up the canons and therefore divides up what rhetoric is, and says rhetoric is only style and delivery. And if you've ever asked yourself that question, where do we get the idea that rhetoric is just empty, flowery language? Thank you, Peter Ramus. And just so you know, he was pretty much run out of town on rails for his arguments, okay, against the classics, because how dare you question the classics? And I would tell you that there's some legitimacy to his argument, but I don't think there's a whole lot of legitimacy to his argument, but I think it's an important thing to consider in order for us to understand how we got from using rhetoric to find truth, using rhetoric to reason, to rhetoric is nothing but empty, flowery language. And there's our answer. It's with Peter Ramus. Okay, I'll be talking to you more. I wanted to keep this below 30 minutes, and I'm at 29 minutes now. So I'm going to post this, and I'll be back with you guys and gals in a little bit to move us forward through the Renaissance.